Welcome everybody who's on YouTube. We are going to begin in just a moment, but we just want to welcome everyone. So hang tight and we'll start in a moment. I'll be kind of riffing as we're waiting. And exactly. Welcome everybody who's on YouTube. All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome. We're going to admit everybody who's here. Welcome to those who are on YouTube. It's good to see you. Steve, it's good to see you. Looking forward to hearing you chant Torah this morning. Tina, it's good to see you. Miriam, you yet, but here you are. And so this is one of those nice intimate services where we don't have B'nai Mitzvah. And so we actually, I'm going to put into the chat the link to the prayer book for you. And that way you can follow along. I have a fun little activity actually that we're going to do during the during Torah as a way to kind of add our own voices to the mix. And so we'll begin on page 74 with the singing of Ma Tovu. Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael. So once again, welcome. We're going to admit all of those other people who are here. And again, if you are just joining us, I'm going to paste into the chat for you the link to the prayer book. We're continuing now on page 76. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, sovereign in the universe, who formed the human being with skill, creating the body's many pathways and openings. It is well known before your throne of glory that if one of them were wrongly opened or closed, it would be impossible to endure and to stand before you. Blessed are you, Adonai, who heals all flesh, working wondrously. Baruch atah Adonai, rofeh kol basar, umafli la'asot. And we move forward now in our prayer book. We're on page 78. Elohai neshama shenatata bi te'orahi. 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 We move forward. We're on page 80 as we chant responsively. I call to the screen our clergy associate Ronnie Pressman.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan l'sevivinai, le'achin ben yom uvein laila.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, pokeach ivrim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, matir asurim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, zokef kefufim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, rokah haaretz al hamayim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamechin metzadei gaver.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, malbish harumim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hanoten le'ayef koach.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamavir sheinai meinai, utenu mame afapai.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani b'tzelem Elohim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani bat chorim.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani Yisrael.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, ozer Yisrael b'gvura.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, oter Yisrael b'tifara.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
We join now page 88, Elu Devarim.
Elu divarim she'en lahem shior, she'adam ochel perotehem ba'olam hazeh, ve'hakeren kayemet lo le'olam haba, ve'elu hen, kibud avaim, ugmilut chasadim, ve'hashkamat, beit hamidrash shacharit ve'arvit, ve'haknasat orchim, Uvikor cholim, v'hakdasat kala uvayatamet, v'yun tefillah, v'hava'at shalom, ben adam lechavero, v'tamud Torah, keneged kulam.
We move forward now from that page to Baruch She'amar, page 94.
Baruch Shamar v'haya olam.
Baruch Hu.
Baruch Oseh v'reshit.
Baruch Omer ve'oseh.
Baruch Ozer u'mekayem.
Baruch merachem al haaretz.
Baruch merachem al habriot.
Baruch mishalem sachar tov l'hireiav.
Baruch Chai la'ad v'kayam lanetzach.
Baruch podehu matzil. Baruch Shemo. Moving forward now, we sing a special psalm for Shabbat, Psalm 92, page 96. Mizmor shir leyom haShabbat, tov le'olad nai, ulezamer le'shimcha elyon, ulezamer le'shimcha elyon. Mizmor shir elyon, ulezamer l'shimcha elyon, ulezamer l'shimcha elyon. Page 97. Ashrei Oshrei Betecha, Od Yahalelucha Selah.
Ashrei Am Shekakalo, Ashrei Am Shadonai Elohav.
Lala David, Arun Chai Hamelech, Varvachashim Chale Olam Vaed.
B'chol yom avachaka, v'halala shimcha le'olam va'ed.
Gadol Adonai Me'od, V'li Gedulato Ein Cheker.
Dor l'dor yishabach ma'asecha, uvuratecha yagidu.
Adar Kivod Hodecha, V'divrei Niflotecha Asicha.
Ve'zuz noratecha yomeru, gedulatcha saprena.
Echerab Tuvachaya Bihu, V'tzidcha Dacha Yiranenu.
Chanun mirachum Adonai, erech hapayim hu gedol chesed.
Tov Adonai Lakol, V'rachamav Al Kol Ma'asav.
Yoducha Adonai kol ma'asecha, v'chasidecha yivarchucha.
Od Malchutecha Yomeru, Ugvuratacha Yedaberu.
Lehodia livnei ha'adam gevuratav, ukvod hadar malchuto.
Utechamahu Kol Amim, Umem Shaltacha B'chol Dor Vador.
Somech Adonai l'chol hanoflim, v'zokef l'chol hakafufim.
Nekol Elecha Yisaberu, Ve'ata Noten Lahem Et Ochlam Be'ito.
Hoteach et yadecha, umasbi l'chol chai ratzon.
Ikaronai B'chol Doracha, V'chasid B'chol Ma'asav.
Karov Adonai l'chol kol rav, l'chol asher yikra'u ve'emet.
Tzon Yirei Av Yaseh, V'et Shavatam Yishma V'yoshiem.
Shomer Adonai et kol ohabav, ve'et kol harishaim yashmid.
Ilat Adonai Yedaber Pi, V'yaveret Kol Basar Shem Kodsho Le'olam Va'ed.
Anachnu nivarek ya, me'ata ve'adulam. Hallelujah.
You dance in your seats a little bit. Psalm 150. Hallelujah, 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 Birki Aruzah, hallelujah, Bikurata, hallelujah, Gerov, hallelujah, 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 beminim berika. Hallelujah, 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 Mitzil Tzlei Shama. Hallelujah, Mitzil Tzlei Shua. Kohan Shama, Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Let's hear you, or metaphorically, I guess. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
I don't know about you, Rabbi, but I could hear them,
Yes, yes.
all of them. except
Especially Steve
Miriam.
Lee on the drum. I loved it. It was
That
so
is true. But Miriam, I could not hear you.
all right. So we're going to move forward now to our Chati Kaddish. And again, if you're able, if you need the screen near you, you can of course be seated, but if you're able, I'll invite you to rise, page 106.
Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah. V'yamad yivrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei. V'chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayedu kol beit Yisrael. B'hagala uvizman kariv v'yimeru. Amen. Yehesh me Rabbah mevarach. Le'olam olam me'amaya. Yitbarach, v'yishtabach, v'yitbar, v'yitrama, v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar, v'yitalev, v'yitalal, shemedu kudeshav richu, le'lamin kol berchata, v'shirata, tushbechata, v'nechemata, damiran bi'alama, v'yimeru. Amen.
We'll remain standing. We're on page 108.
Baruch et Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach le'olam va'ed.
Seated together, a special prayer for nature, page 110. Baruch atah, Baruch atah, Adonai Elohim, melech haolam. Baruch atah, Yotzer or uvorech Hoshem, Oseh shalom, uvorech hakol. Yotzer or uvorech Hoshem, Oseh shalom, uvorech hakol. Page 112. Rabbav Tanu, Adonai Eloheinu, Chemla Gedola V'tira, Chamalta Aleinu, Ba'avur Avoteinu, Ve'imotenu, Shevatchu V'cha, Shevatchu V'cha, Shevatchu V'cha. Lamdem Hukei Chaim, Kem Tichonenu Tzlamdenu, Avrachem Rachem Aleinu, Rachem Aleinu, Vitzim B'libeinu Lehavim, Lehavinu Haskil Lishmoa, Ilmodu Lilamed, Lishmor Ve'lasor. Ulekayem ekol divrei Talmud Toratecha b'avad v'ha'erinenu b'toratecha v'dabek lebeinu b'mitzvotecha v'yached levaveinu le'ava u'yira et shemecha v'lo nebosh v'lo nikalem Viloni kashem le'olam va'ed ki v'shem kodshecha hagadol v'hanora b'atachnu nagila v'nismecha b'shua techa. Baruch atah Adonai habocher be'amo Yisrael b'ahava.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai, Eloheinu, Adonai, Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל, ואמרת עליהם, ועשו להם ציצית על כנפי בגדיהם לדורתם, ונתנו על ציצית הכנף פתיל תכלת, והיה לכם לציצית, וריתם אותו, וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני, ועשיתם אותם, ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם, אשר אתם זונים אחריהם. למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, Adonai Elohechem Emet.
All right, and so we're going to move forward now, page 122, as we join together in Nichamocha. שיר החדשה שיבהו גאולים, לשמחה שפת הים, יחד כולם הודו והמליכו ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, אדוני ימלוך לעולם. So once again, if you're able, I'll invite you to rise, as after singing Sor Yisrael, we'll move into our Amidah.
Sur Yisrael, Kuma Be'esrat Yisrael, Uvdeichenu Mecha, Yehuda ve'Yisrael. Go Aleinu, Adonai Tzivaot Shemo, Kedosh Yisrael. Baruch Atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael. Adonai Sifatav Tiftach Ufi Yagitihilatecha.
Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, v'Elohei Leah. Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanorah, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'Konei Hakol, V'Zocher Chasdei Avot V'Imahot, Umevi Geula Livnei V'Nehem, L'Ma'an Shemo Be'ahava, Melech Ozer U'Moshiach U'Magen, Baruch Atah Adonai, Magen Avraham, Bezrat Sarah. Atagi bor le'olam Adonai, Mechaye hakol ataharav, Lehoshia. Mashif haruach umorid hagashem, Mechalkel chayim bechesed, Mechaye hakol berachamim rabim. Somech noflim verofe cholim, Umatir asurim, Umekayem emunato, Lishene afar, Michamocha ba'al givurot, Umido melach, Melech me'mitz umechaye, Umatzmiach Yeshua, V'ne'eman atah lehachayot hakol, Baruch atah Adonai mechaye hakol. Nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam, Keshem shemakdishim oto b'shmei marom, Kakatuv ayad nevi'echa, V'kara zel ze ve'amar, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevot, Meloch ol haaretz, Kevodo, Adir, Adirenu, Adonai, Adonenu, Ma'adir Shimcha bechol haaretz, Baruch Kevod Adonai, Mimkomo. Echadu Eloheinu, Hu Avinu Malkeinu, Hu Moshienu v'Hu Yashmienu, Berakamav Le'nei Kochai. Ani Adonai Elohechem, Yimloch Adonai leolam, Elohai Zion, Ledor Vador. Hallelujah. Ledor Vador Nagid Golecha, Ulnetzach Netzachim Kedushak Nagdish, V'Shivcha Eloheinu, Mi Pinu Lo Yamush, Leolam Vaed. Baruch atah Adonai Ha'el HaKadosh.
We're going to continue now praying in silence as we move either in the traditional words on the page or the words in our hearts through page 142. And when we're finished, you can be seated. Page 142. Oh, say shalom, bimroma, say shalom, aleinu, ve'al kol Israel, ve'imeru. Say shalom imromav, say shalom aleinu be'al kol Israel ve'imeru amen. Oh, say shalom. Meru, amen. All right, so now we're going to move into Seder Kriyat HaTorah, into the reading of our Torah. And though, because we're kind of all at home, our custom is when we're in the sanctuary and we have access to the Torah, we say the prayers as we take the Torah out. But this is more for chinuch. This is more for learning's sake. And so we're not going to necessarily do the grandeur of taking Torah out. We'll move directly into the reading of our Torah. And so we're going to be reading beginning at the beginning of our portion, actually, the first few verses of our portion. We've got two different readers today. So I'm going to put in right now a link to the portion for all of us if we want to follow along. And our first reader this morning for the first 4 verses of our Torah portion is going to be Alan Berner, followed afterwards by Steve Lee. And so we're going to call Alan to the screen to read, though we need 2 aliyot this morning, a first aliyah and a second. So who wants to be our blessers for aliyot? I saw there was a hand up. Morty, do you want our first aliyah, or is that a slip of the finger? All right. So Morty, you'll be number 1, and we need number 2. Just raise your hand or press the raise hand if you want to be number 2. Did I see Stan's hand? Did you raise your hand quickly, Stan?
I'll do it. I didn't raise my hand, but I'll do it.
We have 2 other hands raised. So between Tina and Lisa, which one of you guys wants to do it?
Tina, why don't you do it?
All right, cool. All right, so Tina will go. So first Morty and then Tina. So we call to the screen. Morty, Ya'amod. What's your Hebrew name?
Oh, Mordechai ben Yechiel, V'utavora.
Mordechai ben Yechiel v'Devorah l'Aliyah Torah, and we'll spotlight you now. And you're up whenever you're ready.
Baruch hu Adonai Hamborach.
Baruch
Baruch Adonai Hamborach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bacha banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Ve'atah titzaveh et bnei Yisrael ve'yikchu elecha shemen zayitzach getihid lema'or ve'alalat ner tamid ba'ohel moed michutz laparochet asher al haida yaroch oto Aharon ubanav me'erev ad boker lifnei Adonai chukat olam ledorotam mi'et bnei Yisrael ve'ata hikrev alecha et Aharon achicha ve'et panav ito mitoch bnei Yisrael lechachano li Aharon Nadav ve'avihu Elazar ve'tamar b'nei Aharon v'asita bigdei kodesh la'aron achicha v'chavod u'tifaret.
Asher Koach.
Yasher Koach, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu torat emet v'chayei olam atah b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen.
And so Tina will call you to the screen. Ta'amod. What's your Hebrew name?
Tamar bat Abraham.
Tamar bar Abraham Lalei Torah. And Steve Lee, Schmuel ben Melech Vechana is going to be reading our portion after you finish your blessing.
Baruch hu Adonai hamvarach.
Baruch
Baruch Adonai baruch li'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Ve'ata tedaber el kochach melev asher miletiv ruach chachma ve'asu et divrei Aharon lekacho lekachanoli ve'ele habgadim asher ya'asu hoshen ve'ephod umil uchtonet tashbetz mitznefet ve'avnet ve'asu bigdei kodesh ve'acharon achicha uvanav lehahanolihi ve'hem yikhu et hazahav ve'et hat-kehelet ve'et ha'argaman ve'et tola'at hasheni ve'et hashesh ve'asu et ha'ephod zahav tehelet ve'argaman tola'at shani v'sheish mashzar ma'aseh hoshev shetei ketefot horot yehi lo al shnei kitzotav v'hu bahar.
Asher Koach again. Asher Koach.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam notah b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. All right. So thank you. Thank you to our two Aliyot. Thank you as well, and especially to Stephen Allen for such beautiful chanting. And we're so lucky to have such learned and talented people in our community. And so now we're going to turn in our prayer book to page 253. Having heard Torah, we'll take a moment to think of those who are ill and who are in need of healing. And so I'll invite you, if you've got anyone you're thinking about, to put it into the chat. May the source of strength who bless the ones before us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us sing Amen. Mishebeira imotenu bekor habracha le'avotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen. So now we're going to move into our Haftarah, and I call to the screen Ronnie Pressman.
Haftarah blessings can be found on page 254. And after I chant the blessing for Haftarah, I'm going to share my giant screen with you, and you can see the Haftarah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar binvi'im tovim v'ratza v'divreihem hane'emarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'Torah Uv'Moshe Avdo, Uv'Yisrael Amo, Uv'Invi'ei Ha'emet V'Tzedek. Zot HaTorah HaBayit Al Rosh HaHar, Kol Gevulo Saviv, Saviv, Kodesh, Kodashim, Hine Zot, Torah Tabayit, Ve'ele Midot, HaMizbeach, Va'amot, Ama, Ama, Va'tofach, Ve'chek Ha'ama, Ve'amarochav, Ugvula el sfata saviv zeret ha'echad v'zeh gav hamizbeach umechek haaretz ad ha'azara ha'tachtona shetayim amot Ve'rochav ama echad umeha'azara haktani ad hazara hagdola arba amot ve'rochav ha'ama ve'ha'arael Arba amot umeha'ariel umala hakranot arba ve'ariel shtem esrei orech bishtem esrei rochav Ravua el arba'a riva'av ve'ha'azara erba esrei orech ve'arba esrei rochav el arba'a Riva'eha v'hagvul savivota chatzi ha'ama v'hachekla saviv uma'alotehu pinot kadim. Hold on, I just lost my stop share thing. Sorry.
Yishar kochech.
Thanks.
Ah,
Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam tzur kol haolamim tzadik b'chol hadorot ha'el ha'ne'eman ha'omer ve'osei ha'medaber u'mekayem shekol devarav emet v'tzedek al ha'torah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al ha'nevi'im ve'al yom ha'shabbat hazeh shenatata lanu Adonai Eloheinu likdusha v'limnucha lechavod ultifaret. Al hakol Adonai Eloheinu anachnu modim lach umavarchim otach yitbarak shimcha befi kol chai tamid leolam va'ed baruch atah Adonai mekadesh haShabbat.
Amen. Thank you, Ronnie. And so we've reached a point where normally we have a Devar Torah, but I actually was thinking, I have a special place in my heart, of course, for B'nai Mitzvah, and we have one basically every week. But I have an especially special place in my heart for weeks that are like this, where like we're a little bit more intimate and we can do something more creative. So I've been thinking actually a little bit about how successful Purim was in the sense that like we split into teams and did trivia and stuff like that. So we're not doing trivia, don't worry. But what we are going to do is I'm going to give you a quick tutorial about what I think is potentially the most important Jewish technological development since the printing press. It's called Sefaria. Really, the internet is, but Sefaria is the best kind of emblematic piece of that internet, right? I'm going to quickly show you how to use it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to split up into groups. And you each are going to get a chance in your group to play around a little bit with Sefaria together in your group and create what is called a Vort about the Torah portion. So what is a Vort? A Vort uses one text very succinctly, and it's like a quick little nugget, like a 45-second little nugget about like, here's the portion, here's the teaching, and here's just a thing that you can take away from that, right? And by the way, I've created a little Vort as well, lest you think that I'm just mining this out to you and not actually creating a Devar Torah. So when you go, I'll go as well. But I want us to be in little teams working together and getting a chance to experiment with Sefaria, which I imagine many have. I know, Steve, I think you're probably an expert at this. So is Ronnie. Raise your hand if you've spent a little time on Sefaria before. All right, so some of you guys, right? So let me share my screen and let me show you what I want us to do. So this is our Torah portion, right? And I'll put into the chat one more time for you if you want the Torah portion. But what I want you to do is I'm actually not gonna. What I want you to do is I want you to click on this little link right here. So when you click on a verse, you find that these resources pop up in the corner, and when they do, you can find commentaries. You can find Talmudic text, you can find Midrashim, you can even find law associated with the text, right? Chassidut means like Hasidic commentaries. Anytime you see the word en, go to it. Unless your Hebrew is amazing, skip it like Kabbalah if it doesn't have en, because it means there's no English translation to the thing you're looking at. So let's say you're looking at the commentary, right? By the way, it turns out Rashi, the most important commentator, or famous commentator at least, he actually doesn't talk about this verse, but Ibn Ezra does, Ramban does, Sforno does. I wouldn't waste time on Ibn Ezra unless you know Hebrew, because it doesn't have the en next to it. But let's take Sforno. You can find what he says about the word lechavod, ulatifaret, right? And the verse I want you to look at is make sacral vestments for your brother Aaron, because a lot of this Torah portion is about the clothing that the priest, that Aaron should wear. And then you can go down. You can find any of the other ones that have ENs. You can then go to the Talmud and see what the Talmud says about this. And by the way, hidden in here, the reason I picked this verse is because there's a lot of interesting nuggets around that link this particular verse to Achashverosh. So if you happen to find it, awesome. And so if you wanted to even, you could go to this Sheets, which is everyone who's ever made a text sheet using this text. And this might give you even more ideas of commentaries that different people have found that they think are interesting. So I'm going to stop here. And once again, I'm going to put into the chat, I had it before, but I'm going to put into the chat the specific verse that you need. So that's verse number 2, okay? And you should have the ability to screen share. So you should have one person in your group share the screen, and then you should play around. And I'm going to give you 10 or so minutes to play around to try to find a text that pops out to you that's really interesting, that you want to share with the group and create a Vort around, which means I'll give you kind of an example. I'll do it, just off the cuff, for example. So let's go to a commentary. Let's go to, I don't know, Rabbeinu Bachia. Bachia says, L'chavod u'tifaret, according to the plain meaning of these words, the meaning is that the weavers of these garments will be honored and glorified by them. Well, that's interesting. Notice they actually say, make sacred vestments for your brother Aaron for dignity and adornment, right? So you would normally think that dignity and adornment would be a description of how Aaron would feel when he puts on that piece of clothing. But it's interesting that Rabbeinu Bachia chooses dignity and adornment, lichavod ulatifaret, to be the workers. And so maybe your vort would be a quick thing about what it means to really think about those people who take pride in the work that they do. You walk in, for example, to a remodeled kitchen. It's about you, but it's also about the people who are proud about the fact that they built that kitchen too. Everybody understand? Like a quick thing on one of the commentaries. Yeah, Steve.
I think you read the English wrong.
Did I read it wrong? Where?
It doesn't say the weavers, it says the wearers.
It totally says the wearers. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah. All right. Well, if it had said the weavers, you would have felt that would have been a great, that would have been great.
However, that alone could be this place that you go with it, that you're thinking could be weavers instead of wearers. Why not?
Totally. You can tell I haven't seen this particular text. I've had a different text, but so my eyes skipped quickly over it. Well, it's not a bad mistake to make, but yes, I went too quickly over it. So everybody get what the assignment is, right?
Yep.
10 minutes in a group. I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. You just want to click accept.
Can you put the link in again?
Yes. Here it is. And you should have the ability to share your screen. Interesting. I'd accidentally directly messaged it to Steve Lee, not to everybody. So, so you should be able to share your screen. You should have one person in each group share their screen. So the first group is Jamie, Morty, Steve Lee, and Tina. The second is Lisa, Miriam, Cohn, and Stan. And the third is Alan, Marge, and then Krensman. I love how you call yourself Krensman, Barbara. It's so great. Yeah. So I'm going to put you in groups now. Okay. All right. So for those who are joining us on YouTube, I think I'm just going to play around and I'm going to do this for you. That way you don't feel bored as you're watching and we're waiting for the 10 minutes for people to come up with their vorts. So, so let's play around. Why not for those who are on YouTube, right? So we can actually pick a different verse. That way, if I end up sharing a vort, it's not the same as someone else. So let's actually play with the first one, right? You shall further instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives for lighting, for kindling lamps regularly. So let's actually see what Rashi has to say about this, because each of these are interesting. And I actually care about the Tamid line, right? Because this, by the way, if you're joining us on YouTube and don't realize this, this is the reason that our temple is called Temple Ner Tamid, right? You shall further instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives for lighting the Ner Tamid, right? Lahalot Ner Tamid, to light the Ner, the candle, perpetually. So what does Rashi have to say? Doing something every night, as it described here, may be termed tamid, continually, just as you speak of the continual burnt offering. Although this was sacrificed only from day to day, so too in the case of the meal offering made in a flat pan, it is said that it should be brought continually. And yet it was only brought thus, half of it in the morning, half of it in the evening. However, the expression tamid, which is used in connection with the showbread, denotes the whole period without a break from Sabbath to Sabbath. So what Rashi is trying to figure out here is what exactly does Ner Tamid mean? And it can mean two things. It can mean a candle that is lit always, that you keep feeding the fire so it never goes out, or it could be the fire that you keep re-upping, that you continually light on a regular basis over and over again. And by the way, this is an interesting metaphor for what religiosity is, right? Is it that you should keep it burning always? Is it that you should always have a relationship to God, always have a relationship to Torah, always have a relationship to mitzvot? Or is it that you should keep reading up, right? So that you go through cycles in your life and you have Shabbat each week, that you pray, for example, maybe in periods of 3 times a day or once a week or once a day, but that you keep reading up your religiosity. And in doing that, that debate is your religiosity, is your connection to God, is the candle supposed to be perpetual or lit from time to time, is really important. Let's see what Sforno has to say, okay? He actually doesn't talk about that, but it looks earlier in the verse. And you should take for yourself, like kach baichu alecha, as the need would arise in the future after the tabernacle had been created. The people should not think that donating oil for the menorah now was the only time that this commandment would be actual. It would have to be replaced from time to time as the supply kept would become depleted on an ongoing basis. So notice God says, you shall further instruct the Israelites to bring clear oil of beaten olives for lighting, for kindling lamps regularly. Here, right? You should instruct at Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, by Hu Alecha, that you should take the Shemen Zayit, Zach, this clear oil. So what he's talking about in this line is, I think, a really important idea, that like you can't ever be done with supporting a community, that like resources get used up. So for example, you can't say I made a donation last year and then not make it this year, because at the end of the day, like money gets spent, resources get used. And so you need not only to keep lighting the candle over and over again, but you need to perpetually keep re-upping those resources. Here it's talking about the menorah, but religiously, you can look at it in general, okay? Let's look at Chizkuni and see what he has to say. Let's see what he says they will bring to you, in order that you will be able to see inside the tabernacle when you enter it and when you leave it. Okay, so why do we bring a candle? Is it to remind ourselves that God is all around us and always there? By the way, that is an important piece to the way that we, in modern times, use the light. But also here, look, what Chizkuni is saying is that there's a practical purpose to this too. You need to be able to see when you walk in. And by the way, when all our lights are off, but the Ner Tamid is there, it gives just enough of a glow in our sanctuary when you walk in at night that you don't bump into things. So it actually does the purpose, right? The point God is making is not that he for whom the lamps of the candlesticks have been lit. The proof for this is that the candlestick stood in the sanctuary, not in the Holy of Holies, from which it was separated by a heavy curtain, the later being in absolute darkness. Not only that, but at the beginning of the chapters dealing with the tabernacle, God had said, they shall donate a contribution for me. Whereas here, this contribution was to be for Moses. So this raises an interesting point. The tabernacle had a bunch of different layers to it. The most inner layer was called the Holy of Holies, and that's where God dwelt. And if the lamp was supposed to perpetually be lit for God, what we would find is that that particular lamp should be inside of the Holy of Holies. But because it's outside, it's not in the place closest to God. Rather, it's in the place that we are bound to see. The lighting of the lamp is for us, not necessarily for God. Let's look at one more, if we have time. I mean, we'll look at more than that if we have more time. The Or HaChaim, who I always love. Let's see what he has to say. Wow, this is a long one. Take it here. We can understand the reason for the word Elecha by referring to Shabbat 22, where the Talmud explains that the words outside the curtain of the testimony mean that the testimony, the Torah, referred to is that all people who came to see the tabernacle realized that God's presence was hovering over the Israelites. Rav defined the testimony as specifically the western lamp, the light on top of the middle shaft of the lampstand. The lamp burned around the clock instead of only at night, although not only did it receive more oil than the other lamps, but the other lamps drew on its oil supply. Shemot Rabbah relates that the scoffers amongst the Jews ridiculed the idea that God would take up residence in a structure by Moses. For this, we see that not only did the Gentiles not credit the idea that God of the heavens had come down to the earth, but even some of the Jews couldn't believe this. Accordingly, even though it was evident that God's presence was indeed in the tabernacle on the first day of Nisan, the day the tabernacle had been erected, they did not consider this as evidence that God's presence would remain there on a permanent basis. Somehow I lost where I was. But he's making an interesting point, counter to the other points that we had seen before, which is that the Ner Tamid exists mainly in order to remind us about God being around, not necessarily for our benefit. And here we go. By telling Moses to command the Israelites, rather than merely to speak to them, as was the norm, this served to make the matter more urgent in their eyes. Had God used the normal form of address, the Israelites would not have felt especially urgent about this directive. God meant for Moses to add his own exhortation to that of God. The expression titzaveh rather than sav was meant to make the directive appear as having emanated from Moses rather than from God himself. God mentioned to Moses that although the directive was phrased as titzaveh, not tidaber, and this was to convey the impression that it emanated from him, this was no reason to treat it more lightly than if it had emanated from God himself. Using the root sav rather than dabar was meant to ensure that the people would relate to this commandment with urgent eagerly. So this is really interesting. When God says to Moses to speak to the Israelites, God uses the word speak. Here, God uses the word command. And the reason God uses the word command actually is because if this was meant to remind us that God is all around us, faith is incredibly hard. And so to have that faith, to have that knowledge that God's presence glows perpetually, you actually need something to push us even further. And thus we have the word command. Interesting point as well. So hopefully you got a few little food for thought, a little bit of riffing. Ronnie, were you here the whole time watching me just riff for those who are on YouTube?
I totally was. And it just, I mean, I use Safari all the time, but there's always fun things that you find. The other thing was that you found Esther Azara when you just showed them before.
Yeah.
I used to study with her at our Beit Midrash in the city.
That's awesome. That's awesome. All right. So I'm going to pull people back in from the breakout rooms and we'll see them shortly.
1 second remaining. Here they come. This could be scary. They could have looks on their eyes of like.
All right. Let's see them enter in. Here we go. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back.
Hello.
All right.
You see your eyes, you guys. Are they gazed or are you excited?
All right. Well, hopefully you found some interesting stuff. By the way, if you want to go back and look, I did this activity with the first verse about Ner Tamid, and I figured you'd heard a lot of the midrashim around Ner Tamid, so that's why I picked a different verse, one that I knew would be juicy and have a lot of interesting stuff. But if you want, because there are people on YouTube, I riffed for 10 minutes on Ner Tamid, so you can always go back and look, as I've wasted time riffing basically and creating a bunch of different vorts using Ner Tamid. So with that, let's hear your quick vort from your group. What text did you find that was interesting, and what can it add to our understanding, not only about the text, but more importantly for our lives? So group one. So we got Henry, Morty, Stephen, and Tina. Who's going to for you guys?
Can we share our screen so we can show?
Yeah, you'll be able to share your screen.
Okay, so let's see. So we picked the Talmudic portion, which is the tractate Megillah. And what it basically says is that they're the same words, the Lekavod U'Tiferet, that occur in this verse, they also occur in Esther, in the Purim story. And Rabbi Yossi ben Hanina says that this teaches us that Ahashverosh was wearing the priestly vestments, which is interesting in of itself. But then I think it was Henry maybe who pointed out that at the end of the Esther story, the king dresses Mordecai in his royal robes. And so here we have Mordecai wearing the priestly vestments of Aaron. We thought that was interesting. But Morty actually was going to say something else, I think, at the very end, but we lost the time.
No, I think that was it. We were trying to come up with what was it? The Vort version of what Steve just said.
Yeah,
I don't know that we succeeded.
What the Vort is like, what's the there? What's the nugget that people can take home with that like influences their life, right? So
I think we talked about how even Ahasuerus, a king, is in the service of God.
Awesome. That's it. That's the there, right? That like that it's not about majesty of themselves. It's kind of like like there's a certain humility when you put this stuff on. So even a king is underneath God. Love it. Okay, so we'll stop sharing this screen, and we'll then go to the next group. So it's Lisa, Miriam, and Stan. What did you
Before
guys?
they start, can I just jump in for a real quickie?
Yeah.
Last night, Cantor Meredith spoke very specifically about clothing, but I was also just struck, Steve, when you read it and said that Ahasuerus was wearing the garment that looked like the priestly garb, and he wasn't even Jewish.
Yeah. All right. So group two.
Okay,
Or
Lisa,
so we
what
think.
was that the text that we used to
Mushar.
Ahasuerus married a Jewish woman, so maybe he converted. I don't know.
Yeah.
You never know.
Shnei Luchot Abrit. Very cool. So Lisa, what do you got here?
and it turns out that one of Lisa's long lost relatives, who was from Safat, wrote this. What was his name? Horowitz.
Lisa, you're muted.
Okay, now I'm going to go back to share.
Okay.
Okay, so this is my great uncle ancestor, Rabbi Isaiah Halevi Horowitz, who was originally the chief rabbi of Prague for a while, and then after his wife died, he made Aliyah, went to Israel, and became the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazim in Yerushalayim when he got kidnapped. And he was like, enough of this politics. So he went to Sfat and became a mystic. And so this is what he wrote in Sfat. So we thought we would look at it. And he talks about the similarity between the word or, which means light, with the word or, which means skins. And he's comparing the garments of Aaron, the Kohen Hagadol, with the garments of Adam and Eve. And that Adam and Eve, before their fall from grace, as it were naked, but were wearing garments of light, kitonot or. And then afterwards, they wore garments of skin, which is also kitonot or, but with an ayin. And so the word for skin is or with an ayin, and the word for light is or with a aleph. But he makes the connection that there are different kinds of holiness, and that you can have purity out of impurity. And so this idea of dignity and adornment can be the light of God, which is what Adam and Eve were wearing before, or the holiness of skin, which actually represents death, but they are clothed and protected by the skin of other creatures. So now that skin, which represented death, has become holy. So
Yeah.
That's what we got.
And if you want to take a look at it in context with Purim, things look pretty dark for the Jews until Esther and Mordecai made it light for them. So,
and the end, Layehudim haita ora v'simcha v'sason vikar, right? And the Jews were glad, and there was light all around.
right.
All right. So with that, thank you. We're going to turn to the third group now. So what did you guys come up with?
Hey, Marge, do you want to share your screen?
You're muted, Marge.
I don't still have it up, Alan.
No, oh, okay. All right. So there were two things that we found. First, we went into the one of the halachic, Hasefer halacha, I think is what we looked at first. And it was something about, the mitzvah itself was about wearing the priestly garments for dignity and adornment, but not being allowed to wear them with the intent of showing how precious and valuable they were. And then we turned our attention back to the Midrashim, and there was a story from Yossi bar Chanina about Achashverosh hosting some sort of a group of his townsmen and visitors, guests, I suppose, at some kind of a dinner, and he donned the priestly garb with clearly not the correct intent. Being such a foolish king, he, rather than wearing it for dignity and adornment, wore it for glory and ornament. And I'm not sure if it's supposed to show his foolishness of not understanding the words dignity and adornment, or the idea of dignity and adornment, but clearly wore it for the wrong reason. And they went on to say that after feeding, I think they had to feed the group in shifts because it was so big, and that he fed the visitors before the townsmen, and there was an argument by the rabbis whether he should have fed the townsmen first, or his own townsmen first, or the visitors. And I think it was Rav Samuel who said he should have fed his townsmen first, because at least if the visitors had acted up, the townsmen would have defended him once they were full bellied. But rather than so he was foolish on more than one account, apparently. But I think the real lesson behind the story was if you I don't know exactly where we went with it, but I think if you let's say if you show your cards too early, like you wear your jewels on the outside of your clothes rather than keeping them in your pockets, maybe after dinner's over you walk out with nothing rather than being defended by your friends and keeping a little bit of what you have.
We also spent some time trying to figure out why they paired Ahasuerus with this text, and kind of came up with the similarity of the phrasing, but that was all we got.
Well, so that's a big piece of it, right? Like the rabbis love hyperlinks. And so if you see a word somewhere and then you see a word somewhere else, it's in its most like legal form, it's called the Gezerah Shava, but that's not what they're doing here. But a Gezerah Shava is like, we need to know something about the context of verse A. It shares a word with verse B. And so therefore I'm going to make a connection between A and B together, right? But that's a little bit what they're doing. They love, and there's a great book that came out like right at the beginning of the internet called The Talmud and the Internet. I think a guy named Jonathan Rosen. I think that's who the name of the guy who wrote it. But he talks about this kind of sense of hyperlink, and that's what's going on here. But you can draw lots of parallels and try to understand what those are. Funny enough, for group number 3, this was the text that I was going to choose to give a quick Vort on. So let me give you 2 other thoughts on this text, and I'll end here. The first is, it is interesting that what the king was doing is essentially cultural appropriation, right? And we have to often think about this, right? There's authentic use of items, authentic use of dress, authentic use of ritual. And then there's use of it because it seems kitschy or cool or makes you look worldly or something like that. And you have to be careful, like I'm not in the camp that you can never utilize other people's cultures. Like we live in a multicultural world. We should be able to take from the other cultures that are around us. But the question is, as you do it, what is the purpose of you doing it? Because you very quickly can cross into the realm of what is called cultural appropriation, where you misuse other people's cultures for your own benefit. You have to be very careful about that, right? But the second piece is the piece that like really stuck out to me, the Rav and Schmuel debate. Right? Who do you feed first if you were the king? You've got 2 groups of people. You've got out-of-towners, and then you've got the people in your town. And who do you feed first? And this is like one of the fundamental tensions of being a rabbi. and it might be unique almost to the rabbinical world. Maybe not necessarily. Politicians might have this problem too. But when my peers get in trouble for being rabbis, right? When they're doing their work really hard, but they still get in trouble, it's almost universally because of this tension. You have your people in town, let's call this your congregants, right? And then you've got your people out of town, the wider Jewish world, the wider world, the need to pursue social justice out in the world, all of that. And in a way, they do feed each other. But I have colleagues who are way too outward facing, and people are like, where were you when my mother was sick? Right? They missed the internal. And then I've got colleagues that are so internal, they take care of their flock. They're such a mensch, but their synagogue is not out in the world. It's not making the name for themselves. People think about going to the other one rather than theirs because it's so Hamish that it's hard to even find it, right? And so you have to find that balance, but you actually usually have to tip one way or the other. And a good synagogue will vacillate between the two. Sometimes it'll be outward facing, sometimes it'll be inward facing. Outward facing helps you grow. Inward facing helps people connect to one another and to you. But the truth is that tension that's highlighted by that dialogue is, I think, one of the fundamental tensions of directions that synagogues can go in. And so I often think about
There should be two people, one doing each role.
If only, right? If only. So I mean, in big synagogues, you have your assistant rabbi and your senior clergy. Your assistant mostly takes care of the flock within. The senior clergy can be the one who shows up on news stations and goes to protests and all of that kind of stuff. So that's one of the big tensions. And I have to tell you, Morty, that even with big synagogues that have the split, the senior rabbi usually gets in trouble if they're not taking care of their flock. So it doesn't work always that way. Though Steve puts in an interesting point. Abraham fed the visitors first too. So with that, we're going to continue now with Aleinu. We're on page 282. I'll put it into the chat. That way it's easier to find page 282 if you're following along. And I'll invite you, if you're able to rise.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, latet gedula leotzer breshit, shelo asanu ki goyei haratzot, velo samanu kamishpachot adama, shelo samchokenu kahem, vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim, umishtachavim umodim, lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, hakadosh baruch hu.
We move forward 5 pages in our prayer book.
V'nemar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad, u'shemo echad.
Be seated together. We're going to pause now and think of those who we've loved and who we've lost. And so I'll invite you to paste into the chat anyone whose name you're thinking of. And I'll invite you to rise at each stage as I call out the category of mourning. And so if you're in your first 7 days of mourning, I'll invite you to rise. The first 30 days of mourning, I'll invite you to rise. Within the first year of mourning, I'll invite you to rise. And then I'll invite you to rise if you're observing a yard site, remembering a loved one. We rise together if you're able, as we move now into the mourner's Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'yalmad divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayachon uv'yomachon uv'chayit achol beit Yisrael, ba'gala uv'izman kariv v'imru amin. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ulamei almaya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yipar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudesha barichu. Le'olam min kol berchata v'shirata. Tushbachata v'nechmata damiram b'yama v'imru amin. Yehi shalom Rabbah min shemaya. V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amin. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amin. Please be seated. So thank you for your participation today. Hopefully you not only got to learn a little bit, but got to meet somebody else and have a little fun. And so with that, we are going to close with one final song, one more rendition of Oseh Shalom. Oseh Shalom b'mromav, Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Shalom b'mromav, Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. Yananai, let's see your mouths moving. Yananai, yananai, yananai.
Your opportunity to unmute, say Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Miriam, Shabbat Shalom.
Hi, Shabbat Shalom,
Shabbat
everyone.
shalom. Thank you.
Nice
I
to meet
was
you.
singing, but you didn't hear me. I was not unmuted.
Don't forget, there's Purim